I thought I was done running. After years of hiding from a past I couldn't escape, I'm finally face to face with the truth. But the cost of freedom might be higher than I'm willing to pay. As secrets unravel and betrayal strikes at the heart of everything I've known, I'll have to decide what I'm willing to lose and what I'm willing to fight for. Before we dive into this powerful story, let us know where you're tuning in from, and if you find it compelling, don't forget to hit subscribe. The wind always smelled the same on Pine Ridge, the sweet, earthy scent of hay, the sharp tang of leather, and the faintest hint of wild grass that seemed to whisper secrets. I loved the ranch for all the small things. The creak of the barn doors as they swung open, the gentle snort of horses in their stalls, and the silence that came after the world had quieted down, just before nightfall. I wasn't like the other girls at school. I didn't care about makeup or dresses or what the other kids were saying. I never quite fit in there. But here at the barn with the horses, it was different. There, I felt like I mattered. I had always been close to animals, but horses, there was something about them. Their strength, their grace, their wildness. They were so much like me, yet so different. I felt like they could understand things I couldn't quite express. My father always told me I was born with a special touch. But even he wasn't always convinced that this gift of mine would get me anywhere. "Lena, are you sure you want to spend all your time with those horses?" My dad had asked me that morning over breakfast, his voice a little too casual, like he didn't really care. But I knew him better than that. My father was a practical man. He ran the ranch with a no-nonsense attitude. He didn't believe in wasting time on things that didn't bring results. He would rather I focus on something like the business side of the ranch, help him with the finances or the accounts, but I never felt the pull to that. What I felt was the call of the barn, the soft whinny of the horses, the flicker of their dark eyes in the stable. That's when I saw him. Thunder. I had heard the stories before. The wild stallion. The untamable beast. He was a creature of legend in our town, but to me, he was something more, a challenge. Every time I saw him, I could feel this strange connection, like he was calling to me, his wild eyes meeting mine through the fence. His coat was sleek and black, like midnight, and he had this wildness about him that seemed to mirror my own heart. But I knew, deep down, that he wasn't just some untamable animal. He was something more, something that needed understanding, not force. It was Mark who brought Thunder to Pine Ridge. He was an older man, with weathered skin and a stubbornness that matched his horses. I wasn't sure why he brought Thunder to our ranch in the first place. Maybe he thought my dad would be able to do something with him. But my father didn't see it that way. "That horse is too much for anyone," he said as he looked at Thunder from the other side of the fence, his arms folded. "Some things just can't be tamed, Lena. Even you can't change that." It stung. It stung more than I cared to admit. But I couldn't back down. Not now. That's when Mark walked over to me, a cigarette dangling from his lips. "You think you've got what it takes to tame him?" Mark asked, his voice rough, like gravel. "You've got guts, kid, but Thunder's no ordinary horse. He's more than wild, he's been through hell." My heart raced. Was this a challenge? I had been waiting for something like this, something to prove that my connection with horses wasn't just a passing interest, but something real. But Thunder? He was a different kind of beast. "I can do it," I said without thinking, the words coming out before I had time to really process them. Mark gave me a long, assessing look before he nodded. "All right then. If you think you can handle him, he's yours to train. But don't say I didn't warn you. He's dangerous, and if you're not careful, he'll break your spirit before you even get close." I felt a twinge of excitement mixed with fear. But I wasn't afraid of Thunder. I wasn't afraid of the challenge. If anything, this was the kind of thing I had been waiting for. My dad, of course, didn't agree. He didn't think I was ready. But in that moment, I knew something he didn't. Thunder wasn't a beast to be broken. He was a soul to be understood. And I was the one who would do it. I took a deep breath, walking closer to the fence where Thunder stood. He watched me, his dark eyes never leaving mine. There was a quiet intensity there, an unspoken challenge. And I accepted it. I wasn't going to fail. Not this time. The next morning, I woke early. The sun was barely up, painting the sky a soft amber. Pine Ridge was always quiet in the early hours, as if the world hadn't fully woken up yet. I walked through the back door of the house and out toward the barn, my boots crunching on the gravel path. It was a calm, almost serene morning, but inside me, a storm was brewing. Thunder. I couldn't stop thinking about him. My dad's voice echoed in my mind. Some things can't be tamed. But what did he know? This wasn't about taming a beast. This was about understanding, listening, and working together. And I was determined to prove him wrong. I reached the fence where Thunder stood, his wild black mane flowing like a banner in the wind. He was waiting for me, as if he knew I was coming. The stallion's gaze was sharp, his dark eyes piercing through the distance between us. I took a deep breath, gathering the courage to step closer. My hands shook a little, but I refused to let it show. I wasn't afraid, not really. But there was something about Thunder, something that made him seem untouchable. Maybe it was his wildness, or maybe it was the stories of him being a rogue, always running free. Whatever it was, I couldn't back down now. I reached out to grab the rope lying next to the fence, my fingers wrapping around it as I prepared to approach him. He snorted, pawing at the ground with his hooves, a clear sign of his unease. But I had to do this for me, for him, and for everything I had ever believed in. You can't do this alone. Mark's voice startled me from behind. I turned to see him leaning against the barn, his eyes studying me with a strange mixture of amusement and concern. He'd been watching me since the moment I stepped out of the house. Thunder's not like any other horse. He's a fighter. And you've never had to deal with a horse like him before, Mark continued, his gravelly voice low. You can't force him, Lena. You'll never win that way. He'll break you. I clenched my jaw, trying to keep the frustration from showing. I didn't want his pity or his warnings. What I wanted was to prove to him, to my father, and to myself that I could do this. I don't need your help, I said, my voice firm. Mark didn't seem surprised by my answer. He just nodded, as if he had expected this all along. Fine, he said, pushing off from the barn and walking toward the paddock. But remember, respect is earned, not demanded. And Thunder's going to teach you that, one way or another. With that, Mark disappeared into the distance, leaving me alone with the stallion. I turned back to Thunder, taking a few slow steps forward. He watched me, his ears flicking back and forth, but he didn't move. I could tell he was sizing me up, trying to decide if I was a threat or not. I held my breath as I slowly moved closer to the fence. When I was within arm's reach, I stretched out my hand, offering it to him as if I were extending a truce. I knew I couldn't force him to trust me, not right away. For what felt like an eternity, Thunder just stared at my hand. I could hear my heart pounding in my chest, the air between us thick with tension. Finally, after what seemed like forever, he took a cautious step forward, his muzzle brushing my hand. My heart skipped a beat. It was a small gesture, but it was something. He was willing to meet me halfway. I didn't waste any time. I gently took the rope and looped it around his neck, speaking to him in soft, calming tones. I could feel the energy between us. Raw, untamed, but slowly starting to shift. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The days after my first encounter with Thunder blurred together. Each morning began with the same quiet determination, the same anticipation. I had spent hours at the barn, learning Thunder's moods, the way his muscles tensed when he was anxious, the way his eyes softened when he was calm. But nothing prepared me for what happened next. It was a Thursday morning, the sun barely breaking through the horizon, casting an orange glow across the paddocks. My dad had asked me to help with the feed, but instead, I found myself walking toward the paddock where Thunder stood, grazing quietly. There was something different about today. Maybe it was the way the morning air felt, crisp and still. Or maybe it was the growing certainty inside me that I was ready for what was coming. I approached him slowly, my hand stretched out like I'd done before. This time, though, I wasn't just trying to build trust. Today, I was going to try something new, something that might push him too far. But I had to try. I took a deep breath and moved closer to the fence. Thunder raised his head when he saw me, his dark eyes locked on mine. His ears flicked back, but he didn't move. This time, he was waiting for me to make the first move. I could sense it. "All right, Thunder," I whispered softly, feeling the weight of the moment. "It's time for us to work together." I gently looped the rope around his neck again, just like I had before. But this time I added pressure just a little bit. The slightest pull, the smallest nudge, a signal to him that I wanted him to move with me. My heart raced as I watched him. For a moment, it felt like he wasn't going to budge. Then, without warning, he jerked his head back, pulling away. I stumbled slightly, but steadied myself. I didn't let go of the rope. I couldn't. If I gave up now, it would be over. He would know that I was afraid, and that would be the end of it. "Not today," I muttered to myself, tightening my grip. "We're doing this." With a firm but gentle pull, I coaxed him again, asking him to move forward. This time, his resistance was stronger. He backed up, pawing the ground, his breath quickening. I felt my stomach tighten with the anxiety creeping in, but I didn't give in. Suddenly, I heard a sharp voice behind me. "Lena, get away from him." I whipped around to see my dad, his face flushed with anger, standing at the entrance of the barn. His hands were clenched into fists at his sides. "You're going to get yourself hurt," he shouted, taking a step toward me. But I didn't move. I couldn't. I had already come too far.
"No, Dad."
"I can do this," I said, my voice barely above a whisper but steady all the same. "I just need you to trust me." He froze, his eyes locking on mine. For a second, the world seemed to stand still. He wanted to protect me, I knew that. But this was my fight, my journey. It wasn't something he could fight for me. "Lena, please," he said, his voice softer now, filled with the worry that had always been there, just beneath the surface. I shook my head. "I'm not backing down. Not this time." And with that, I turned back to Thunder. His muscles were tense, his body coiled like a spring, ready to either run or fight. But I could feel something changing. I didn't need to pull harder. I needed to trust that he would come to me when he was ready. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, Thunder took a step forward. The breath I'd been holding came out in a rush, and I almost couldn't believe it. He was listening.
He was trusting me.
I took another step forward, and he followed. Step by step, we moved together, the connection between us growing stronger with each moment. The tension that had been there melted away, and for the first time, I felt like I wasn't alone in this. Thunder and I were a team. I looked back at my dad. He hadn't moved, but I could see the concern in his eyes, the hesitancy. "It's working, Dad," I whispered under my breath. "It's really working." The days following that breakthrough with Thunder felt like a small victory, but I knew better than to get comfortable. Horses, especially wild ones like Thunder, don't just submit because you ask them to. I had learned that lesson the hard way. The next week brought an unexpected setback. I had been working with Thunder every morning, building on the trust we'd started to establish. He was calmer around me, more willing to follow my lead. But that morning, something was different. He was skittish, more agitated than usual. I approached the paddock with the same quiet determination, the rope in my hand, but Thunder didn't greet me like he usually did. Instead, he was pacing, snorting, and tossing his head. His eyes were wide, filled with a nervous energy I hadn't seen before. I froze. "What's wrong with you today?" I murmured, watching him closely. He was always unpredictable, but today it was more intense. I couldn't place it. I stepped closer, my heart beating a little faster, but Thunder jerked back, moving quickly to the far side of the paddock. He was clearly spooked, but I didn't understand why. It wasn't like him to act like this. He'd always been headstrong and independent, but he had never been this jumpy. "Thunder," I called, keeping my voice calm. "It's okay. We're okay." But the stallion was having none of it. He continued to move away from me, his hooves pounding the dirt with increasing intensity. I felt my stomach tighten. I didn't want to push him, but I also knew I couldn't back down. If I did, it would be the same as giving up, and I wasn't about to let that happen. Come on, Thunder. It's okay. Come back, I coaxed gently, taking another slow step toward him. In the distance, I heard the sound of the barn door opening, followed by the unmistakable heavy footsteps of my father. He appeared in the corner of my vision, his eyes narrowing as he took in the scene. "Lena, stop," he said sharply. "He's too worked up. You can't force him right now." I didn't want to listen. I didn't want to hear it. My pride, my determination, all of it flared up inside me. "I'm fine, Dad. I know what I'm doing," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. But Thunder wasn't calming down. The tension in his body was palpable, and my efforts to close the gap between us only seemed to make him more anxious. His nostrils flared, and for a brief moment, he reared up, a high-pitched whinny escaping him as he spun in circles, clearly distressed. I froze, my heart in my throat. I could feel the fear rising inside me. "Thunder, please," I whispered, but it felt like I was talking to a completely different animal. The wildness that had once felt so majestic now seemed more like a threat. I took a few steps back, trying to give him space, but that wasn't enough. He suddenly bolted, running at full speed toward the far end of the paddock. I scrambled to get out of his way, my pulse racing. "Lena!" my dad shouted, his voice full of concern as he rushed forward. "Are you okay?" I nodded quickly, still in shock, but the truth was, I wasn't okay. I had failed. I had tried to push Thunder too far, and now he was more unpredictable than ever. I could feel the weight of it settling in, the crushing disappointment. "I don't know what happened," I muttered, shaking my head as I watched Thunder tear around the paddock, kicking up dust in his wake. "I thought we were getting somewhere." My dad's hand rested gently on my shoulder. "Lena, you can't force him. He's not a machine you can just train with commands. You have to understand him. You have to listen not just to his movements but to the quiet things, his fears, his frustrations." His words stung, but they were true. This wasn't about control. This wasn't about winning Thunder's obedience with a few clever tricks or forceful pulls on the rope. It was about understanding what made him tick, what made him run from the things that scared him. I glanced at my dad, seeing the concern in his eyes, but also the wisdom he had gained over the years. He had seen this before. He had lived with it. "I'll do better," I said, my voice soft but resolute. "I'm not giving up." The days after Thunder bolted around the paddock were a blur of frustration and self-doubt. I had tried, but I hadn't succeeded. My father's words echoed in my mind every time I stepped foot in the barn. "You have to listen, Lena. It's not just about controlling him." But what did that mean? How could I listen to a horse who wouldn't even let me close? It was early one morning when I decided I needed to try something different. My hands were shaking slightly as I walked into the barn, but I was determined. Today, I was going to do it right. I found Thunder standing by the fence, his ears flicking back and forth. He didn't seem as panicked as he had been, but there was still that underlying tension in his movements. I stood still for a moment just watching him. I didn't make any sudden moves or try to approach him. Instead, I waited. Minutes passed, but I didn't move. Thunder snorted softly and took a few steps toward me, his eyes still wary but curious. I stayed where I was, calm, breathing deeply. It was strange, but I had the distinct feeling that he was waiting for me to make the next move, just like I had done before. Only this time, I wasn't rushing it. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Thunder took another step closer. His body language had softened, his ears were forward, his steps were less tense. He was still cautious, but he wasn't running away. I took a slow breath and took one step forward, closing the distance between us just a little. He didn't move. I kept my body relaxed, not forcing the issue, but inviting him to come to me on his own terms. And then, something unexpected happened. Thunder lowered his head slightly, his nostrils flaring as he took a deep breath. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was facing a wild, untamable animal. I felt like I was standing in front of a partner, a teammate. I reached out with my hand, just enough to touch his shoulder, but I didn't push it. I wanted him to feel safe, to know that I wasn't a threat. My fingertips brushed against his coat, and he flinched slightly, but didn't pull away. It was small, but it was progress. "It's okay, Thunder," I whispered softly, keeping my voice low and calm. "I'm not going anywhere." I waited. His head shifted slightly toward me, and I felt him relax just a bit more. I carefully placed the rope around his neck, gentle but firm. This time, I didn't tug or try to guide him. I simply stood there, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing, waiting for him to accept me. For several long moments, nothing changed. But then Thunder moved. Just a little, at first a soft step forward. I didn't expect it, but I didn't hesitate. I followed his lead, gently guiding him toward the fence. Slowly, methodically, we walked together. I felt a sense of connection, of something deeper than just training. Thunder was finally listening. He was finally trusting me. I couldn't help but smile to myself, a surge of pride rising in my chest. But then, something unexpected happened. Out of nowhere, Thunder reared up on his hind legs, a burst of wild energy erupting from him. I instinctively took a step back, the rope slipping in my hands as I scrambled to keep my balance. I had never seen him act like this before. His wildness was back in full force, and I was suddenly reminded of how fragile this connection truly was. But I didn't panic. Instead, I took a deep breath, keeping my stance steady. I wasn't going to let fear control me again. "Easy, Thunder," I said softly, trying to steady my breath, my voice calm. "It's okay. You've got this." For a moment, it seemed like he was ready to fight again, but then, as quickly as it had started, he relaxed. He slowly lowered his head, and his body softened. The fire had gone out of him, and he seemed calm. Maybe for the first time since I had met him. I carefully tightened my grip on the rope, guiding him in a circle. He followed, almost willingly now, his movements smooth and deliberate. We were no longer at odds. We were moving as one. I woke up the next morning with a renewed sense of purpose. The day before had been a breakthrough with Thunder, but I knew that it wasn't the end. No, it was only the beginning. Trust had been built, yes, but it was fragile. Every moment with him now felt like a test, one where I had to prove that I was worthy of his trust and that I could handle his wild spirit. Today, I had a plan. It wasn't complicated, no big tricks, no bold moves. It was simple. I wanted to see if I could lead Thunder into the paddock, not just with a rope but with the quiet strength that comes from mutual respect. I made my way down to the barn, each step filled with the weight of expectation. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a soft golden light over the fields. The cool morning air felt fresh against my skin, like the world was holding its breath, waiting for what would happen next. As I entered the paddock, Thunder was grazing, his body still, his head lowered in concentration. I watched him for a moment, taking in his every move. He was more relaxed now, but I knew it wouldn't take much to disrupt the balance. "Morning, Thunder," I whispered softly, approaching him slowly. I didn't want to startle him, didn't want to make the same mistakes I had before. The rope was still in my hand, but today it was secondary. What I needed most was his attention and trust. I stopped a few feet away from him and stood still, letting him come to me. His head lifted, and those dark eyes met mine. It was an unspoken understanding between us. Thunder had learned to recognize me as a presence, not just a threat or a person trying to control him. I took a deep breath and held out my hand, palm open. He didn't move, but he didn't shy away either. For a moment, we just stood there, silently connected. It felt like time slowed, like the world outside of this paddock didn't matter. It was just me and Thunder. Then, very slowly, I moved toward him. My steps were deliberate but calm. I reached out, gently resting my hand on his shoulder, the same place I had touched him before. His muscles twitched under my hand, but he didn't pull away. "Good boy," I murmured, trying to keep my voice as steady as possible. I couldn't let my nerves show. This was the moment that would tell me if all the work I'd put in was enough. With one more deep breath, I slowly wrapped the rope around his neck, just as I had before. The contact was minimal, but it felt more confident this time, less like a test, and more like a natural step in our growing relationship. Thunder didn't resist. He stood still, even shifted slightly closer to me, his breath steady and calm. I stepped back and gently tugged on the rope. No force, just a nudge. Thunder hesitated for a moment, his head turning to look at me, but then he took a step forward. I could feel the bond we had created, the unspoken understanding between us that no amount of force could replicate. We moved together, slowly, deliberately, toward the paddock gate. It wasn't a quick, proud walk like I had imagined. It wasn't a show of strength or dominance. It was a quiet acceptance, a trust that had taken weeks to build. Thunder wasn't just following me because I told him to, he was walking beside me because he wanted to. As we reached the gate, I opened it slowly, guiding him through. For a moment, I couldn't help but smile. This was a victory, but not the kind I had expected. It wasn't about winning. It was about proving that trust could be built, one small step at a time. But just as I was about to let out a breath of relief, Thunder suddenly reared up. The moment had felt too perfect, too easy. My heart skipped a beat as I took a step back, the rope slipping through my hands again. He was panicked, his hooves striking the air with alarming force. I froze, just for a second, and in that moment, it was clear. Thunder wasn't done testing me. He wasn't done testing us. I didn't have time to second-guess myself. Instinct took over, and I stepped forward, reaching out to steady him. I spoke in a calm, steady voice, just like I had the day before. "It's okay. Easy, Thunder. You're okay." He calmed slightly, but there was still tension in his body. I knew I couldn't push him too far. I needed to get him to settle, but without force. "Come on," I whispered, my voice barely above a breath. Slowly, Thunder's head came down. His hooves stopped kicking. The tension in his muscles began to ease, and I guided him forward once more. The rope now tightened my hand, but with no tension. As we walked forward, I realized something that hit me like a ton of bricks. This wasn't just about taming Thunder. It wasn't about me winning over the wild stallion. This was about us both learning to trust one another, to give each other space, but also to stand together in the face of uncertainty. I didn't need to control him. I just needed to be there, to show him that I could be trusted, no matter how much the world seemed to shake. The days had been getting longer, the early mornings turning into warm afternoons, and Thunder's progress seemed to be stretching with each passing day. Our trust had deepened, but it wasn't without its challenges. Every time I felt like I was on the brink of something significant, Thunder would remind me that growth wasn't linear. Still, I felt more connected to him than ever. It was a Wednesday morning when everything changed. I was feeding Thunder in the barn, the familiar routine grounding me. His hooves clacked softly on the ground as he ate, his head lowered in concentration, but I could feel his energy, a hum beneath the surface that wasn't quite right. I stepped back and watched him carefully, unsure of what exactly was making him uneasy. Then, from out of nowhere, I heard the unmistakable sound of a car engine approaching. I turned, squinting through the barn's open door as a black SUV rolled up the gravel drive. My stomach tightened. I hadn't been expecting anyone. Not today. The car stopped just outside the barn, and the door swung open. I saw a man step out, tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in a suit that seemed out of place in this dusty, rural setting. His features were sharp, with dark hair neatly combed back. He was the kind of person who commanded attention the moment he entered a room, but this was no ordinary room. "Lena," the man called, his voice deep and almost too smooth. "I hope I'm not interrupting." I blinked, trying to place him. I didn't recognize the face, but there was something about him that tugged at my memory. As he walked closer, I stood taller, instinctively putting myself between him and Thunder. He paused when he saw me, his eyes briefly scanning my face before he offered a tight smile. "I'm James," he said, his gaze flicking briefly to Thunder, who had raised his head and was now watching the newcomer with a wariness that matched my own. James? I repeated, feeling the name stir something faint but unfamiliar. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I knew he was connected to my past somehow. His gaze remained on Thunder, studying him as if the stallion were the only thing of interest. "I see you've been making progress with him," he observed, his tone implying he had been watching from afar. "Impressive." I didn't reply immediately. Something about the way he spoke about Thunder, like it was a business transaction, left a sour taste in my mouth. "What do you want?" I asked bluntly, my voice a little sharper than I intended. James looked at me with a flicker of surprise in his eyes before that smooth smile returned. "I like that." He took another step toward me. "I'm here because I've heard things, Lena.
People talk.
They say you've tamed Thunder. That's not something you come by easily." My heart rate quickened, and I stepped forward, blocking Thunder from his view. "What's that supposed to mean?" He raised his hands in mock surrender. "Don't worry. I'm not here to take him from you. I just wanted to have a conversation." I crossed my arms, standing my ground. "I'm listening," I said, still unsure of his intentions. He tilted his head slightly, as though considering my words. "I know who you are, Lena. You're the daughter of Willard Larson, aren't you?" My breath caught in my throat as I stared at him. Willard Larson. My father. My eyes narrowed, and I clenched my fists. It had been years since anyone had mentioned his name, let alone anyone who knew me. "I don't know what you think you know, but my father's dead," I said, the words coming out colder than I intended. James didn't flinch. "I'm sorry for your loss." "I truly am," he said, though there was no sincerity in his voice. "But you should know your father had certain interests in this place. Interests that might involve more than just farming horses." My pulse raced. There was a weight behind his words, something cryptic and threatening that I couldn't understand. Thunder, who had been standing calmly before, suddenly shifted uneasily, his muscles tightening again. I glanced at him briefly, then back at James. "What do you mean?" I asked slowly, my voice steady despite the rising tension in the air. James took another step closer, and for the first time, I saw something flicker in his eyes, an emotion I couldn't quite place. "What I mean, Lena, is that there are people who would be very interested in Thunder. And in you. I think you should be careful. The past has a way of catching up with you." I opened my mouth to respond, but he turned on his heel and walked back toward the SUV. "I'll be in touch," he called over his shoulder before getting into the car and driving off as quickly as he had arrived. My mind was spinning. Who was he? What had he meant by all of that? And what connection did my father have to all of this? I looked at Thunder, who was still tense, his dark eyes fixed on the driveway where the car had just disappeared.
His unease mirrored my own.
I wasn't sure what had just happened, but one thing was clear. The calm I had been enjoying was about to be shattered. The day after James left, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I spent the morning feeding Thunder, grooming him, doing everything I could to keep busy and keep my mind off the conversation we'd had. But the more I thought about it, the more unsettled I became. My father. Thunder.
James.
It all seemed to be connected somehow, but I couldn't piece it together yet. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the barn, I made my way to the porch. I needed fresh air, space to think. I leaned against a railing, gazing at the rolling hills in the distance, but my mind was miles away, racing through the events of the past 24 hours. What was James really after? I couldn't understand why he'd appeared out of the blue, talking about my father like he knew secrets that had been buried for years. And why did it feel like he was threatening me without actually saying it? I looked out at Thunder, who was grazing in the pasture, his head low and calm. If only I could see inside his mind, maybe I could understand what he was feeling, what I was missing. Thunder had always been a reflection of my own emotions, the key to my thoughts, but now, even he seemed distant. A knock on the door pulled me from my reverie. I tensed, a rush of panic rising in my chest. I hadn't expected anyone. Not today. I walked slowly inside, cautious, and opened the door, fully expecting to see someone I didn't recognize. But standing there wasn't a stranger, it was Jack. For a moment, I didn't know what to say. He was standing in front of me, looking as calm as ever, but there was an unfamiliar tension in his eyes. His hands were in his pockets, and the familiar warmth I had once felt around him was replaced by something else, something I couldn't identify. "Lena," Jack said, his voice quiet but steady. "We need to talk." I stepped back, holding the door open wider. "Talk about what?" Jack hesitated before stepping inside. I closed the door behind him, unsure of what he was going to say. His presence was almost a comfort, but the unease from James's visit still lingered in the back of my mind, and I couldn't focus fully on Jack yet. "I came because I'm worried," Jack continued. He met my gaze, and for the first time in a long time, I saw a flicker of something I hadn't expected: concern. "You're pulling away, Lena. Something happened, didn't it? You're not yourself. And you're keeping secrets from me." His words stung. I wasn't used to seeing him like this. Jack and I had always been open with each other, and now it felt like the walls between us were growing taller, brick by brick. "I'm not keeping secrets," I said, avoiding his eyes. "It's just complicated." Jack stepped closer. His face softened, and I could tell he was doing everything he could to understand. But how could I explain something I barely understood myself? The words tangled in my throat, and I wished I could just say something to make it all go away. Make the past disappear. "Lena, you can't keep carrying this weight on your own. You've been alone long enough. You don't have to face whatever it is," Jack began, but I cut him off. "I'm not alone," I said sharply. "I have Thunder." I didn't know why I snapped at him like that, but it felt like the truth. Thunder had been there for me when no one else had, even before Jack. He was the only one who really understood me, the only one who trusted me without question. But Jack wasn't satisfied. "You can't shut everyone out, Lena. You need people, even if you think you don't." His words struck a chord in me, and I felt a pang of guilt. Maybe he was right. Maybe I had been pushing people away, but it was easier that way. With Thunder, there was no judgment. No expectations. "I don't need people. I need answers," I muttered, more to myself than to Jack. He paused, his face clouded with confusion. "Answers to what?" I closed my eyes, trying to gather my thoughts, but I knew there was no way to explain it to Jack. Not yet. Not until I had figured it out myself. "I don't know yet." Jack sighed, his shoulders sagging as though he were carrying the weight of my uncertainty. "Lena, please.
Don't shut me out."
I looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time, I saw how much he cared. How much he had always cared. I didn't want to hurt him, but I didn't know how to let him in. "I don't know what to do," I whispered, my voice cracking. Jack reached out, his hand resting gently on my shoulder. "Then let's figure it out together." I shook my head, my mind still spinning with everything James had said. "I don't know if we can. There's too much I don't understand." Jack's grip tightened slightly, his eyes intense. "We'll figure it out. I'm not going anywhere." For the first time since James had arrived, I felt a sense of hope flicker in my chest. Maybe I didn't have all the answers, but I wasn't alone in this anymore. Jack wasn't going anywhere. And maybe, just maybe, together we could uncover the truth. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of rain tapping against my window, a soft, steady rhythm that felt strangely comforting. Maybe it was the storm that had passed through my mind the night before, but I woke up with a sense of clarity that I hadn't had in days. The world outside was still, quiet. Everything seemed to pause, as if it was waiting for something. Or perhaps it was me who needed to pause and listen. I made my way down to the barn, the heavy air thick with moisture. Thunder was waiting for me, his ears flicking as I approached. I could sense his unease, his own version of uncertainty. "Hey, boy," I murmured as I ran my fingers through his mane. The familiarity of his presence soothed me, grounding me. As much as I wanted to push forward and figure everything out, I had to slow down. I couldn't keep running from the truth, and I couldn't keep pretending that James's sudden reappearance in my life didn't have something to do with the secrets my father had hidden. The past had a way of catching up, didn't it? No matter how far you ran, no matter how many years you tried to bury it, it always found a way to surface. Lena, I think I know what's going on. Jack's voice broke through my thoughts, and I turned to see him leaning against the fence, his expression serious. He'd shown up unexpectedly this morning, and I wasn't sure whether it was a sign of his unwavering commitment or his concern. Maybe both. I stood still for a moment, uncertainty clouding my mind. My fingers tightened around Thunder's reins, and I looked at Jack, searching his eyes for the truth. I wasn't sure I was ready for it, but I knew I had to face it head-on. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice more guarded than I intended. Jack stepped closer, looking down at Thunder before meeting my gaze again. He didn't look like the same man who had tried to reassure me yesterday. There was something different about him now, something more resolute. He'd clearly made up his mind about something. "I've been doing some digging," he said, his voice low. "I know you're trying to protect yourself, but you're not alone in this." I felt a flicker of alarm at his words. "Digging?" I repeated, confusion spreading through me. "What do you mean?" Jack's expression softened, and he took another step forward, placing a hand on Thunder's back. "I've been looking into your father's records, his past, and everything that happened with the ranch." My heart skipped a beat. The secrets I had always known existed, but never dared to look at, were now coming to light. There it was. The thing I had feared the most. My father's legacy. The unanswered questions about what had really happened all those years ago. I had told myself it didn't matter, but it did. And now Jack had brought it into the open. "Jack, you shouldn't." "Lena, listen." Jack cut me off gently. "I know you're scared, but you can't keep running from it. We have to know what's going on. We have to know why James showed up here, and what he really wants." His words were like a punch to the gut. What was I really protecting by keeping the truth hidden? My father had been a great man, but he had also made mistakes. And now, those mistakes were threatening to come back and haunt me. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my racing thoughts. "So, what have you found?" I asked, my voice shaking slightly. Jack hesitated, looking like he was considering how to word it. Then he spoke, his voice steady but heavy with the weight of what he had discovered. "Your father was involved in something bigger than we thought. It wasn't just the ranch. It was—" Jack paused, his brow furrowing. "There were people he owed. And those people are the reason why James is here." I swallowed hard, my stomach churning. I wanted to argue, to push it all away, but I knew Jack was right. I had to know. I had to understand what had been kept from me all these years. "What are we dealing with?" I whispered. Jack didn't answer right away. Instead, he placed a hand on my shoulder and turned me to face the horizon. "I don't know yet," he said, his voice thick with uncertainty. "But I will. And we'll figure it out together." A wave of emotions hit me all at once. Fear, anger, and a deep sense of betrayal. Everything I had known about my father, about myself, was now in question. The past was alive again, breathing down my neck. But there was no turning back now. The truth was out there, and whether I was ready for it or not, I had to face it. As I looked out over the field, I could feel the weight of what was coming. The storm wasn't just in the sky anymore.
It was in me.
And I had no choice but to ride through it. The house felt eerily quiet. The hum of the refrigerator and the soft creak of the wooden floors under my feet were the only sounds that broke the silence. I walked through the living room slowly, my thoughts as heavy as the storm clouds gathering outside. James was here. After all these years, James was back in my life, and I still had no idea what he wanted from me. But one thing was clear: I couldn't run anymore. Not from him, and not from the truth about my father. I stood in front of the door to the study, the one room in the house my father had kept locked most of the time. The door was always closed, as if it hid something important. Something my father didn't want anyone to see. My fingers hovered over the brass handle, the weight of what was on the other side of that door pressing against my chest. With a deep breath, I opened the door. James sat at my father's desk, his back to me. The room smelled faintly of old books and leather, the same smell that used to comfort me when I was younger. But now it made my skin crawl. The air felt thick, like a secret that had been waiting too long to be uncovered. "You've been snooping around, haven't you?" James's voice broke the silence, cold and calm, as though he already knew everything. He didn't turn to face me, but I could feel his eyes on me. I clenched my fists, trying to control the anger bubbling inside me. "I want answers, James. And I want them now. Why are you really here?" He slowly swiveled the chair to face me, his expression unreadable. But there was something in his eyes, something that made my stomach tighten. He knew more than he was letting on, and I wasn't sure if I was ready to hear it. "I came back to finish what I started," he said quietly, his voice low but sharp. "Your father's legacy wasn't just about the ranch. It was about something much bigger. And now, you're in the middle of it." I took a step forward, my heart pounding. "What are you talking about?
What was my father involved in?"
James finally stood up from the desk, his tall frame casting a shadow over me. "He wasn't just running a ranch, Lena. He was involved in things I couldn't protect him from. And now, they're coming for you." A chill ran down my spine. The weight of his words pressed against me like a vice. This wasn't just about a ranch or an inheritance. It was about something darker, something that had been lurking in the shadows for years. I wanted to scream, to demand answers. But instead, I held my breath, waiting for him to say more. "You think this is about money, don't you?" James continued, his voice almost a whisper now. "It's not. Your father owed people, Lena. Dangerous people. And when he died, those debts didn't just vanish. They've been looking for someone to pay them back." I shook my head, unable to process what he was saying. "This doesn't make sense. My father would never." "He did," James interrupted, his tone final. "And now, they're after you. They think you know something, Lena. Something that could bring everything crashing down."
"But you don't, do you?"
I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. The room suddenly felt too small, too suffocating. What was he telling me? And why did I feel like I was just beginning to understand how deep the lies went? "What do you want from me?" My voice came out shakier than I intended. I couldn't mask the fear that was creeping up on me. James stepped closer, his face inches from mine. "I want you to help me finish this. We need to find out who's pulling the strings and put an end to it before it's too late." I felt my pulse quicken. Was he trying to protect me? Or was this all just another part of the game? My mind raced, but my heart kept screaming at me to trust him. But I couldn't ignore the nagging doubt. This wasn't just a coincidence. James had been a part of something that I didn't fully understand, and now I was tangled in the web of it all. But there was no escaping. The storm was here, and it was coming for us all. "What are we really dealing with, James?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. James's face hardened, his jaw clenched as he turned away, staring out the window. "We're dealing with people who don't play by the rules, Lena. And if we don't stop them, we'll both be buried under the weight of their secrets." I couldn't breathe. The walls seemed to close in around me as the truth settled in. This wasn't just a simple family mystery. It was a dangerous game, one that I was caught in whether I liked it or not. And now I had no choice but to play along. The rain had started falling harder as I left the study, my mind reeling with the weight of everything I'd just learned. My father's secrets. James's cryptic words. The realization that my life was now entangled in something far beyond what I could have ever imagined. I walked out of the house and into the yard, my boots sinking into the mud as I made my way toward the barn. The storm seemed to echo the turmoil inside me, the wind howling and the skies darkening as if the world itself was holding its breath. I didn't know who to trust anymore, but one thing was clear. There was no turning back now. James had offered me a deal. Help him finish what my father had started and uncover the truth about those who were pulling the strings behind it all. I didn't know whether to be terrified or relieved. I'd spent my whole life thinking my father was just a man with a love for horses and a heart of gold. Now I was learning that there was far more to him than that. The barn door creaked as I pushed it open, stepping inside to find James already there, leaning against one of the wooden posts, his expression unreadable. The flicker of the lights cast shadows on his face, making him look more distant, more dangerous than I'd ever realized. "You came," he said, his voice steady, but with a hint of something softer underneath. Maybe it was concern, or maybe it was something else. I nodded, taking a moment to steady myself before I spoke. "I don't have much of a choice, do I?" My words were sharper than I intended, but the weight of the decision I'd just made felt too much to bear. James straightened up, the look in his eyes turning serious. "No, you don't. But I'm not doing this alone. And you're not either." He paused, as if choosing his words carefully. "You'll need to trust me, Lena. We're in this together now." I didn't say anything at first. Trust him? How could I? But then, as I looked at him, really looked at him, I realized that maybe this was the only path left. The path of survival. My father had gotten himself tangled in something far more dangerous than I'd ever understood, and now I was left to untangle the mess. The silence stretched between us, thick with the unspoken words I wasn't ready to voice. "What now?" I finally asked, my voice barely above a whisper. James stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. "We find out who's behind this, who's been pulling the strings, and who's been watching you." A chill ran down my spine at the mention of being watched. How long had they been watching me? And more importantly, who exactly was they? I had no answers. Only more questions. "Do you have any idea where we should start?" I asked, trying to hide the tremor in my voice. James hesitated for a moment before speaking. "We start with the people who knew your father. We need to dig into his business dealings, the people he was close to." Before he could finish his sentence, a loud noise interrupted us. The barn door slammed shut behind us, and we both whipped around, instinctively reaching for the weapons we kept hidden. A figure stepped into the dim light, their face obscured by the shadows. I couldn't make out their features, but I could feel their presence, dangerous, menacing. My heart pounded in my chest as the figure took a step forward. Well, a low voice drawled. "If it isn't the little princess, all grown up and playing with the big boys now." I froze, my blood running cold. The voice. It was a voice I recognized from somewhere, but I couldn't place it. My mind raced, trying to connect the dots, but nothing came to me. James moved in front of me, positioning himself as a shield. "Get out of here, Thompson. This doesn't concern you." But the figure only laughed, stepping forward into the light. The moment I saw his face, my heart sank. It was him. "I think it concerns me more than you think," Thompson said, his grin wide and menacing. "And I think it's time we settled things once and for all." The world seemed to freeze in that moment, the shock of Thompson's sudden appearance hanging heavily in the air. My mind struggled to catch up, and everything I thought I knew about the game we were playing suddenly felt like it was slipping out of my control. How had Thompson found us so quickly? And why did it feel like he was already one step ahead? James didn't flinch. He stood his ground, eyes hard and determined, ready for whatever Thompson had in mind. But I could see the tension in his jaw, the way his hands tightened around the hidden knife at his side. It was clear this wasn't just another threat, it was personal. "I'm not here for a chat, Thompson," James said, his voice low and calm, but there was an edge to it, something that told me this wasn't the first time these two had crossed paths. Thompson grinned, his eyes flicking to me before he took a step closer. "No, I'm sure you're not. But the princess here, she's a different story. I think she's finally starting to realize just how deep her father's secrets run." I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. "What do you know about my father?" The question slipped out before I could stop it, and my voice wavered despite my best effort to keep it steady. I wasn't ready for whatever answer Thompson was about to give, but I needed to know. My entire life had been built on a lie, and I had to find the truth, even if it tore me apart. Thompson's smirk deepened as he took another step forward, his boots crunching on the gravel floor of the barn. I know more than you could ever imagine, sweetheart. Your father wasn't the man you think he was. He was playing a dangerous game, and now so are you. I swallowed hard, trying to push past the fear tightening in my chest. I refused to let him see how much he was getting to me. You're full of shit. I spat, my voice sharper than I intended. You're just trying to scare me. And it's not going to work. Thompson chuckled, but the sound was cold, like the scrape of metal on stone. Oh, I'm not trying to scare you, princess. I'm trying to help you understand that you're already in way over your head. I took a step back, my eyes darting to James for some kind of reassurance, but he was already moving. His body language was tense, but he didn't look afraid, not of Thompson. He looked like a man who had been caught between two worlds for too long, one foot in the past and one in the future, never quite able to escape the shadows that clung to him. You need to leave, Thompson, James said firmly, his voice unwavering. You're not welcome here. Thompson shook his head, amusement dancing in his eyes. I don't take orders from you, James. But maybe I'll leave. If Lena agrees to come with me. I have some interesting information she might want to hear. I froze. My blood ran cold at the idea of going anywhere with Thompson. But the thought of learning more about my father, the real truth, not the lies I'd been fed, was a temptation I couldn't ignore. My curiosity battled with my instincts, the latter screaming at me to stay away from this dangerous man. James must have sensed my hesitation because he stepped closer, his voice urgent. Don't listen to him, Lena. He's manipulating you. Thompson's laugh cut through the tension like a knife. Manipulating? No, I'm just offering her the chance to see the world for what it really is. And if she's smart, she'll take it. His gaze turned to me, his words more dangerous than the knife James kept hidden. After all, it's not every day you get to learn what really happened to your father. The truth, Lena. The truth about who he really was. I wanted to say no. I wanted to scream at him and tell him to get the hell out of my life. But something deep inside me, a spark of curiosity, a need for closure, made me ask, what truth? Thompson's smile widened, a predatory gleam in his eyes. Meet me tomorrow at the old docks. Alone. I'll tell you everything. If you're brave enough to hear it. Before I could respond, he turned and vanished into the storm, his footsteps fading into the darkness. The moment he was gone, I felt a wave of panic wash over me. What had I just agreed to? I had no intention of going to the docks alone, but the truth might be there, just out of reach. James was watching me closely, his expression dark. You're not going, Lena. Not alone. But I could see the uncertainty in his eyes, the fear that he wouldn't be able to protect me from whatever Thompson had planned. And for the first time since I'd met James, I realized that maybe, just maybe, I was the only one who could uncover the truth. And maybe it wasn't just for me. Maybe it was for my father. The rain was relentless, falling in sheets as I stood at the edge of the docks, the scent of salt water mixing with the wet earth beneath my feet. The wooden planks creaked as the wind howled, carrying the sound of distant waves crashing against the shore. Every nerve in my body was on edge. I shouldn't have come alone. I knew that. But there was no turning back now. I'm here, I muttered to myself, my voice barely audible over the storm. The old, abandoned docks stretched out into the darkness, a place where memories of my father seemed to linger in the air. I had spent countless hours here as a child, watching ships come and go, unaware that the world I thought I knew was built on lies. And now, this place, the one where I had always felt safe, was the backdrop for a meeting that could change everything. I checked my watch again. 10:15 p.m. Thompson was supposed to be here by now. My hands were trembling, and I wrapped my arms around myself, trying to steady the shaking. I knew what I had to do. I had to hear him out. I had to hear the truth about my father. But even as the thought crossed my mind, I could feel a cold, sick sense of dread settling in my chest. What if Thompson was lying? What if he was just playing me? Get it together, Lena, I whispered, shaking my head as if I could shake off the fear. I took a deep breath and stepped forward, my boots clicking against the damp wood. The dim light from the lampposts did little to cut through the thick mist rolling in from the sea. Everything about this place felt wrong now, like a scene from a nightmare that was just beginning. Then, out of the shadows, I saw him.
Thompson.
He emerged slowly, like a ghost, his long coat billowing behind him in the wind. The hood of his jacket was pulled up, obscuring most of his face, but I could still see the glint of his eyes as they met mine. His presence sent a shiver down my spine. There was something about him, something unsettling that made me want to turn and run, but I couldn't.
Not now.
"You came," he said, his voice low and smooth, like the sound of oil on water. I was beginning to wonder. I didn't respond. I simply watched him, waiting for him to say something. Anything that would explain why he had brought me here. Thompson took a few more steps forward, then stopped just a few feet away from me. The wind pushed his coat around him, and I felt a sudden rush of cold air, making me shiver involuntarily. "You must be wondering what I have to tell you about your father," he said, his gaze intense. "It's not the kind of thing you want to hear, but it's the truth. And whether you want to face it or not, you have to. There's no going back now, Lena." I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper, afraid of what he might say. He stepped closer, his face now illuminated by the dim light of the lamppost. His lips curled into a smirk, but his eyes remained cold, dangerous. "Your father wasn't just some businessman, Lena. He was involved in things much darker, much more dangerous. He was part of a criminal network. A network that—" Before he could finish, a loud crack echoed through the air, followed by the sound of footsteps approaching. I whipped around, my heart racing.
James.
He came into view, his eyes scanning the area, his body tense as he moved toward us. His arrival was like a lifeline, and I felt an immediate sense of relief wash over me. I hadn't even realized how much I needed him until now. "You shouldn't have come here, Lena," James said, his voice strained with anger and concern. "I told you it was too dangerous." Thompson chuckled darkly. "And here I thought you were the one pulling the strings, James. Don't worry. I won't bite. Not unless she asks." His eyes flicked to me, a knowing look passing between us. I could feel the tension rising, the air thick with the weight of the situation. James had made it clear that he didn't trust Thompson, and I could see why. The man had an aura of menace about him that was impossible to ignore. "Lena," James said, his voice softening as he took a step closer. "We need to leave.
Now."
But Thompson's laugh rang out again, sharp and cutting through the thick fog. "You really think you can just take her away from me, James? You're too late." I felt a sudden rush of fear as Thompson's words sank in. "Too late for what?" I asked, my voice trembling despite myself. Thompson's smirk deepened, and he leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Too late to protect her from the truth, Lena. Your father was part of something much bigger than you could ever imagine. And now, it's your turn to play the game." The words hit me like a blow to the stomach, and for a moment, I could barely breathe. What was he talking about? What game? James stepped forward, pulling me back behind him protectively. "Stay behind me, Lena," he said, his tone low and urgent. "This isn't over." Thompson's eyes narrowed as he took a step back, his posture relaxed but dangerous. "We'll see, won't we?" He turned and began to walk away, disappearing into the fog just as quickly as he had appeared. I stood there, my heart pounding in my chest, trying to process everything that had just happened. Thompson's words were like a weight around my neck, suffocating me, dragging me deeper into a world I wasn't ready for. But there was no turning back now. I had crossed a line I couldn't uncross, and the truth, whatever it was already too close for comfort. The walk back to the car felt like it took hours. Every step was heavy, each one sinking me deeper into a pit of uncertainty. My mind raced, replaying Thompson's words over and over, trying to make sense of them. My father, part of a criminal network? It didn't make sense. I looked at James, walking beside me, his hand barely brushing against mine. He hadn't spoken a word since we left the docks, his jaw clenched tight. He was angry, at me, at Thompson, at the situation, but most of all, he was angry at himself. I could feel it in the tension of his posture, the way he kept his eyes straight ahead, avoiding my gaze. "James," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the sound of our footsteps. He didn't respond, just kept walking, his eyes fixed on the path ahead. "James, please." I stopped walking, grabbing his arm gently. He froze, but didn't turn to face me. "I need you to talk to me." Finally, he exhaled deeply and turned to look at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of frustration and sadness. "Lena, I don't know what you want me to say." I swallowed hard, the weight of his words sinking in. "Tell me the truth. What did Thompson mean? About my father, about everything?" He hesitated, his hand twitching as though he wanted to reach for me, but didn't know if he should. After what felt like an eternity, he spoke, his voice soft and low. "It's complicated," he began, his words slow and deliberate. "I didn't want to bring you into this. It's dangerous, Lena. It's too dangerous. But now that Thompson's involved, I can't keep protecting you from it. I should have told you earlier, but I didn't know how. I didn't know if you were ready." I felt a sharp pang in my chest. "Ready for what?"
"For the truth," he said.
"For the fact that your father wasn't just a businessman. He had ties to the underground, ties to the organization that runs a lot of the city. They were dangerous people, Lena. People who don't play by the rules." His words hit me like a physical blow. My father, the man I'd loved, the man I'd looked up to, was part of something so dark, something I couldn't even begin to understand. I wanted to scream, to run, to hide from the reality that was slowly unraveling before me. "I don't believe you," I whispered, shaking my head, trying to deny the truth he was laying out before me. James reached out, his hand gently cupping my face. "I wish I could tell you it wasn't true. But I can't. I know you don't want to believe it, Lena. But you have to. Your father was hiding a whole other life from you, one that he kept from everyone. And now that you're involved, there's no going back." My head was spinning, my thoughts a blur. "Why didn't you tell me before? Why did you let me find out this way?" James's grip on my shoulders tightened. "I didn't want to put you in danger. I thought I could protect you from all of this, from the lies and the danger that surrounds it. But now, I'm not sure if I can anymore." His words rang in my ears, a bitter reminder of how little I knew about the world I'd been living in. I thought I had everything under control, that I was strong enough to handle whatever life threw at me. But this was something I wasn't prepared for. "What happens now?" I asked, my voice trembling. "What do we do now?" James's eyes softened, and for a moment, I saw the man I had trusted, the man I had once believed could protect me from anything. But even he seemed lost, unsure of what to do next. "We keep moving forward," he said quietly. "We find the truth. We deal with Thompson. And we protect you, Lena, no matter what." A heavy silence fell between us, broken only by the sound of rain tapping against the pavement. I nodded slowly, though part of me wasn't sure if I could go any further. The road ahead seemed uncertain, and the weight of everything I had just learned was almost too much to bear. "James," I whispered again, my voice barely audible. "I'm scared." He stepped closer, pulling me into his arms, holding me tight as if trying to shield me from the storm that had suddenly descended upon us. "I know, but we'll get through it.
We have to."
I closed my eyes, feeling the warmth of his embrace, but even in his arms, I couldn't escape the truth. The truth that my father's secrets had cost me everything. And the truth that whatever came next would change my life forever. The rain was pouring down in sheets as we made our way toward the warehouse. It felt like the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for what was to come next. I didn't know if I was ready for this. I didn't know if I'd ever be ready. James was beside me, his hand gripping mine tightly, but his eyes were cold, distant. He was ready for this. He had been ready for this for a long time. And now, after all the lies, the secrets, and the betrayals, We were finally going to face Thompson, the man who had been pulling the strings behind everything. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as we approached the grimy, old building, the sound of the rain against the asphalt almost drowned out by the rapid thumping of my pulse. This was it. No turning back now. "You're sure about this?" I asked James, my voice barely above a whisper. He looked at me, his expression unreadable, before nodding. "There's no other choice. Thompson needs to be stopped. Once and for all." I nodded back, even though part of me wanted to run. But I couldn't. I couldn't abandon the truth, and I couldn't abandon James. He had risked everything for me, and now it was my turn to stand by him. As we reached the door of the warehouse, James pulled out his gun, checking it one last time. He looked at me, his jaw set in determination. "Stay close. And no matter what happens, don't try to be a hero. Just stay safe." I nodded, swallowing down the fear that had built up in my throat. "I'm with you." The door creaked open with a loud protest, and we stepped inside. The warehouse was dimly lit, the air thick with the smell of old metal and oil. The sound of our footsteps echoed through the cavernous space, making it feel even more deserted than it already was. And then there he was.
Thompson.
He was sitting at a desk in the far corner, his back to us, his fingers steepled in front of him as though he were waiting for us to arrive. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, almost casual. "I knew you'd come," he said, without turning around. "It was just a matter of time." James stepped forward, his gun trained on Thompson. "This ends tonight, Thompson." Thompson chuckled, the sound low and unsettling. He slowly turned around in his chair, the faint smile on his lips only making the situation feel more surreal. "You think so?" He raised an eyebrow. "You really think this ends tonight? You don't know who you're dealing with." I could feel the tension in the air, the heavy weight of the moment pressing down on me. I wanted to speak, to say something, but my throat felt tight. Thompson was unpredictable, dangerous, everything I feared and more. "You've lied to me, used me, and manipulated everything I've ever believed in." "It stops now," I said, my voice firmer than I expected, but there was no mistaking the fear in my eyes. Thompson's eyes narrowed as he stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. He was tall, imposing, almost like a shadow looming over us. But as I looked into his eyes, I saw something different. It wasn't just anger. There was fear, too. "You really think you can just walk away from all of this?" he scoffed. "You think you can just undo everything?" James stepped forward again, his tone icy. "We can undo your empire, Thompson. We can end everything you've built." Thompson's smile faltered for a moment, and in that brief second, I saw something I hadn't expected, a crack in his confidence. It was fleeting, but it was enough. Then suddenly he lunged. It happened so fast that I barely had time to react. The sound of gunfire rang through the warehouse, sharp and deafening. I felt a jolt of fear race through my body, but before I could process what was happening, everything went silent. James had fired. Thompson staggered back, his hand clutching his side where the bullet had hit. He glared at James, his expression now twisted in rage. "You think you can stop me? You think you've won?" He spat, his voice filled with venom. "I've always been one step ahead of you, James. And I always will be." I could see the blood soaking through Thompson's shirt, but it wasn't enough to take him down. He was still dangerous, still a threat. "James!" I shouted, trying to pull him back. But he was already advancing, his face a mask of fury. For a moment, I feared we were both going to lose everything. But then something shifted. James paused, his gun lowered, his chest heaving with heavy breaths. And that's when I saw it. Thompson's fear. It was real, raw, and it showed. "It's over, Thompson," James said, his voice cold and final. "You've lost. We've won." And in that moment, I realized something. It wasn't about winning or losing. It was about breaking free from the chains that had bound us all. It was about moving forward, about choosing our own fate, no matter what had happened in the past. Thompson's eyes narrowed one last time before he slumped to the floor. He was defeated, and the world he had built came crashing down with him. The aftermath of that night still hangs in the air like the smell of rain on the pavement. The city was quiet, almost too quiet, as if holding its breath for what was about to happen next. James and I walked side by side, the weight of everything we'd just gone through sitting heavy between us. But there was something else too, something lighter, like we were finally free, not just of Thompson, but of all the years of fear, doubt, and unanswered questions. We made our way out of the warehouse, our footsteps muffled by the rain that hadn't stopped since we arrived. James didn't say anything at first, and neither did I. Words seemed too small for what we'd just survived. But I knew we'd both been changed. It had been a long, brutal road, but we'd made it. "Are you okay?" I asked, glancing up at him. He didn't immediately answer. His eyes were fixed ahead, focused on the road. He was thinking, I could tell. There was a storm behind his eyes, but it wasn't the same as before. It wasn't anger or rage. It was something else. "I'm fine," he said, his voice low but steady. Then he looked at me, his expression softer than I'd seen it in a long time. "I'm glad you're okay." His words hit me harder than I expected. I wasn't used to hearing him admit how much he cared, how much he was willing to risk. I wasn't used to seeing him vulnerable, but here he was, opening up, even if only just a little. I smiled, though it felt bittersweet. "We did it." We stopped him. James nodded, but there was a heaviness in his gaze. "We stopped him, but not everything can be fixed that easily." I understood what he meant. Thompson's empire was gone, but the scars it left on both of us, on our lives, those wouldn't disappear overnight. And then there was everything else. The life I'd lived, the person I'd been before all this, before the lies, before I knew who I really was.
There was no going back to that.
As we reached the car, I noticed how much the city seemed to have changed. It was still the same, yet everything felt different. For the first time, I didn't feel the weight of Thompson's shadow hanging over me. It had been lifted, but I wasn't sure what would come next. Would I ever be able to completely shake off the feeling of being hunted? Would I ever be able to stop looking over my shoulder? James opened the passenger door, and I hesitated for a moment before getting in. He followed, shutting the door behind him. The car's engine hummed to life, cutting through the quiet, and for a moment, I allowed myself to relax, just a little. As we drove, my mind wandered back to everything we'd been through. The investigation, the danger, the betrayals. The lies that had turned into truths we weren't prepared for. But we had done it. We had confronted the darkness and come out the other side. And now we had a chance to rebuild, not just our lives, but ourselves. "What happens now?" I asked, breaking the silence. "What do we do with all this?" James took a deep breath, his hands gripping the wheel tighter for a moment. He was thinking, but this time it wasn't about revenge or retribution. It was about something bigger.
"We move forward," he said.
"We rebuild. Together." I nodded, my heart swelling at his words. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about living. And not just living, but living freely, without the chains that had bound us for so long. The rain had started to let up, the first rays of dawn breaking through the clouds, casting a soft glow over the city. It felt like a new beginning, a fresh start. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could face it head-on. As we reached the edge of the city, the streets started to clear, and the sun peeked over the horizon. The light felt almost like a promise. A promise that, no matter what had happened in the past, we were stronger now. We had learned from our mistakes. We had learned what really mattered. And we had each other. "You're not alone anymore," James said, his voice softer now, as if he were reassuring himself as much as me. I smiled, a true smile this time, not filled with the bitterness and fear of the past. "Neither are you." We drove in silence for a while longer, the road ahead unknown, but somehow less intimidating. The lessons we'd learned along the way, about trust, forgiveness, and the strength we didn't know we had, would guide us, no matter what came next. And maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something better.